Hi, my name is Farzad Lahuti. I'm a condo director, CCI, Toronto director, and real estate investor and broker. I'd like to welcome you to CCI Toronto's Condo Convos casual chats about important topics. Our today's topic is curb appeal for condos, costs and pros and cons involved. Listen in and be on your way to achieving social and financial success at your condo. We thank our sponsor today, First Service Residential Property Management. Joining me today are Sabine Grimes, Christine Adjith, and Ashley Winberg. Christine is a partner at Adams and Miles, chartered accountants. Ashley is a lawyer at Elia and Associates, working with condominium condo law and labor laws, and she specializes in human rights and construction. Sabine, to my left here, she is a designer and principal of Unison Group, and she designs interior design services for both existing condos and new condos all across North America. Sabine, I'd like to open with you. What you think of curb appeal? To me, curb appeal is the attractiveness of a property for sale and surroundings when viewed from the street. What's your thoughts on it?
Well, I think that's a great point. I think one aspect of curb appeal is the financial gain that the building has because it's appealing from the exterior. Another thing that's important to note is that curb appeal is also not only the financial reality or the financial benefit that the curb appeal gives it, but it's also the emotional response. And of course, when things look good, we like them more. So as residents, we would feel more comfortable and happier in a building that has better curb appeal. So I think it would be great to be able to give 3 examples of curb appeal in very different situations. First example that I'm going to give is the Hazelton Hotel, which everyone is very familiar with downtown. It has a transitional and more kind of classic architecture on the exterior. It's layered with awnings, planters, and all of these elements that are added on the exterior create this very intimate environment on the interior. And the interior is not visible from the street. So the curb appeal and the exterior identity extends to the interior of the building itself. And so that way, even though the Hazelton is a private building, the curb appeal creates that kind of identity, and it's very obvious what the brand is for the whole building from the outside. Another building that is completely different is Casa Condominiums, which is a couple blocks away from it at Yonge and Charles. Casa Condominiums is a very modern building, and the interiors are very apparent from the outside. And I think this is a really great example of curb appeal in the fact that the interiors interact with the exterior. It's a very different approach than what we have in the Hazelton. And I think that that dialogue with the interior and the exterior has just creates a very different sensibility for the building altogether. These examples that we spoke about are examples that are for new construction. And if we could speak about one example of curb appeal that was made by altering a property to create curb appeal, I would use a condominium that's around 40 years old, and which was originally created out of a red brick that was recently painted. The cost of paint was minimal, and I think that's important to note. But the impact that the paint has in the building is significant, and it creates a decent amount of curb appeal, and it also drastically alters the identity of the building from what it was previously.
What can condo board members consider doing in enhancing their curb appeal?
So going back to what I had mentioned earlier, it's important to note that there is a monetary return sometimes by making exterior improvements, such as creating a better signage, creating better wayfinding, a way to define the exterior entrance, just simply by beautifying the building. But there's also the emotional aspect to it as well. So sometimes a board is simply happier, residents are simply happier if it feels more like home. And you may not have that, that direct monetary association with it. And I think that's important to note, because there's some elements that are subjective, and there's other ones that are a little bit more, I guess, practically based. And I think if we were to use a couple of examples of how to increase the amount of curb appeal, I think some specific examples would be, ones that I hadn't touched on previously, would be to, in some cases, alter the interior design of the lobby if it has a strong relationship to the exterior. And I guess that would be true in the case of Casa condominiums, where you have that strong dialogue with the exterior.
I know a lot of my clients often want to redo the balconies. Is that something that is beneficial?
I think so. Sometimes balconies look old and dated. And if we are able to provide just a simple facelift for the balconies, again, it can drastically change the exterior look of a building. And it can automatically make it feel more current and on par with the surrounding buildings, and I suppose the competitive nature of real estate in Toronto.
Actually, as board of directors of a condo, what are the legal considerations that they have to take into account when taking up a project?
Well, there's one, it's a primary consideration. Unfortunately, many condo boards don't really think to look into this. Oftentimes, there are restrictions in a site plan agreement, a declaration, a description, or even a shared facility agreement that restrict what can and cannot be done on the property. So it's important that corporations review these documents to see if there are any restrictions, and if there are, these documents may need to be amended, or the consent of a third party may need to be obtained. For instance, oftentimes you see in site plan agreements that certain portions of the property need to be loading bays. So if the corporation wanted to turn a designated loading bay into a green space, it would have to obtain the consent of the city in order to do so. And as many corporations are also parties to shared facilities agreements, so if they want to make a change to their landscaping, perhaps they need to get the consent of the adjacent landowners as well. And then, as a director, you know that the primary question most boards call us about is, do we need to notify owners? Do we need to get their approval before we do this work?
And when to do it?
Exactly. So the first thing you have to find out, it's always good to consult with a lawyer, of course, is whether the contemplated work constitutes an addition, alteration, or improvement to the common elements. For the purpose of this discussion, I'll just use those three terms together and say change. So if it constitutes a change, you may need to obtain owner approval, and you may need to notify owners. However, that all depends on the cost. So first I'll let you know what is the definition, what constitutes an addition, alteration, or improvement. I'll give you some examples, and then we'll talk about how the cost plays out. So let's say some corporation is wanting to do some work outside, and the corporation needs to consider first, is this work being done as part of the corporation's repair and maintenance obligations with respect to the common element area at issue? If it is, it may not be an addition, alteration, or improvement. If it is not, then it would be. Now, if it is being done as part of a corporation's repair and maintenance obligation, the material used must be reasonably close in quality to the original as per current construction standards, because things do change over time. Some material may no longer be available. Now, how this plays out in practice, I'll give you an example. So let's say that building that's being talked about earlier, it was originally brick. Let's say a couple of years ago, 10, 15 years ago, they painted the entire thing brown. Now the brown paint's peeling, various locations, and they need to repair it. And the corporation has an obligation to maintain and repair the exterior facade of the building. So the board decides we're going to repaint the entire exterior facade brown. That would not be a change. Therefore, the corporation would not need to notify owners, nor would have to obtain their
So
approval.
they would just paint it brown as it
They
was?
can do so. That would be in the reserve fund. That would be fine. Now, let's say instead of painting it, it's failing, it's all, it's peeling everywhere, they want to stucco the entire exterior
So
facade.
they changed the material.
They're changing the material, exactly. They'd still be doing it as part of the repair and maintenance obligation, but the material's changing. So then you want to look at, okay, what is the difference in price? Like, what's the difference in cost for that change? And so you'd basically take into the actual difference in price between paint and stucco, because the scaffolding, all of that would still be the same, presumably, but what's the difference in the two types of projects? And that's what I'll discuss in a few minutes. And as you also know as a board member, there's frequent turnover in corporations, boards from time to time. So perhaps the exterior facade is brown, painted brown 2 years ago, and the new board comes in and they don't like it. They want to paint it gray, like in the property that's being discussed. If the paint isn't peeling and there's no need to repair and maintain it, that work is going to be a change completely. And the corporation may need to notify owners or obtain their approval. And that, again, is dependent on the cost. So when you're looking at cost, this is how it plays out. If the cost of the work, so the change in the stucco example, if the cost of the difference between stuccoing the building and painting the building brown, if the difference in price between the two types of projects would be less than 1% of the corporation's, 1% or less in the month in which it's implemented the work, less than the corporation's budgeted common expenses for the current fiscal year, the corporation would be able to proceed by way of a board resolution and would not need to obtain owner approval. However, as a director, you know that corporations, it can be very political. So you might want to notify owners and just say, hey, we want your feedback. We want to do a straw vote. Again, straw vote, not binding. Now, let's say that the work cost of the change in that month is going to be more than 1%. Then the corporation would need to notify owners. There's specified things that would have to be notified, owners would have to be notified of. And then within 30 days of receiving that, owners would be able to requisition a meeting if they wanted to challenge it or have a vote on it. Now, a change would be substantial and owners would have to approve it. 66 2/3 would have to approve it if the cost of the change would be 10% or more of the corporation's budgeted common expenses for the current fiscal year, or if the corporation decides to treat it as substantial. That's a board decision. So these are things that a lot of boards have to take into consideration, and also just keep in mind that once all those procedures have been adhered to ensure that you've entered into the proper type of CCDC contract and consulted with a lawyer to ensure that your corporation is fully protected.
Thank you. Christina, as a CPA and auditor, what are the financial considerations to take into account for board members when doing a project such as curb appeal?
Right. So Sabina and Ashley have already commented on some of them, like determining the cost to see if it qualifies as a change or what's the return on investment. But if you rewind to the very beginning of a project, the number one question that any homeowner should ask themselves is there enough money? Do I have enough money to proceed with this? How are we going to pay for this? So there are a couple, when you look at a corporation's financials, there are quite a few sources of financing. So I'll just outline some of them for you very quickly. So the first source is the operating fund. So the operating fund is all of the accumulated surpluses and losses ever since day one of the condo. So if the corporation has a healthy operating fund, a board might decide to draw down on that. So best practices suggest to have in their operating fund about 1 to 2 months of maintenance fees, just as a rainy day fund, just a cushion. But if the board has a good handle on budgeting and it has perhaps maybe 4 to 5 or in excess of that months of maintenance fees, they might decide to draw down on their operating fund. Another source is the reserve fund. So there are certain criteria. This is a restricted fund, so there are certain criteria in the Condominium Act that have to be met in order to expense a project out of the reserve fund. But assuming that those criteria are met, the next question is my reserve fund adequate? So our interpretation of adequacy of reserve fund, everyone has different interpretations, but ours is the board or is the condominium setting aside the right amount of contributions every year into its reserve fund in accordance with what the engineers proposed in their last notice of future funding, and is the engineer doing those reserve fund studies every 3 years based on what the Condo Act is stating they must do. So if there is not enough in the operating fund, there's not enough in the reserve fund, a third source is borrowing. So borrowing from a financial institution. So there are more legal ramifications for this. There's a bylaw must be passed, and there are certain steps and timelines that have to be met. So if a condo board is thinking of going ahead with borrowing, they should contact their legal counsel well in advance of when they want to undertake the project.
And to that particular point, often corporations have a general borrowing bylaw for $5,000. That's not going to be sufficient. It has to be a specific borrowing bylaw for the project. On another note, sometimes contractors will say, hey, we'll let you pay for the cost of the work over a number of years. However, if they're charging the corporation interest on that, that's deemed to be a form of financing. So in my professional opinion, they would also require a borrowing bylaw for that specific financial arrangement.
All right, sure, I should specify, because I did mention that it's financial institutions, so it's not just borrowing from a bank, but if you have extended loan payment terms and interest is charged on that, that's also considered borrowing. Okay.
Even to a contractor?
Even to a contractor, yes. So if there is not enough in the operating fund as it stands, the reserve fund, the board does not want to borrow. Another option is increasing maintenance fees. Not popular, but it can be done over time if this is a project that needs to be done perhaps 5 to 6 years in advance. You want to smooth out those increases, so there's more advanced planning required for that. And the last resort, the horrific special assessment. So nobody likes to hear that, but sometimes it's essential. For example, if the balconies need to be replaced, it is going to improve curb appeal also, but if it's an essential project, a special assessment is an option. But sometimes it's a harder pill to swallow if you want to impose a special assessment for something that's more aesthetic, like replacing the front garden or something like that.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the items that are allowable on the reserve fund? As a board member, I always like to take advantage of the reserve fund before any of the other accounts that you mentioned.
Yes.
But talk about the gray areas or what's clear in using the reserve fund. What items are clear?
Sure. So we get a lot of questions on the reserve fund. Can I put this through the reserve fund? Can I put that through the reserve fund? So ultimately, us as auditors, we do consult with lawyers as well, but we do refer back to the Condo Act that has the definition of what the reserve fund allows. So if we look at that definition a little bit closer, maybe it'll tell us what can and can't go through the reserve fund. So the Condo Act defines the reserve fund as a fund for major repair and replacement of existing common elements and assets of the corporation. So if we break that definition down, number one, it has to be a major repair. It can't be minor, it can't be ongoing maintenance or upkeep of the front lawn. That sort of thing cannot go through the reserve fund. It must be major. Secondly, it has to be a replacement of existing assets or common elements of the corporation. So existing means it must have existed from day one of the corporation when the declarant passed it along. So if it is something brand new that you're putting along, for example, if you have a townhome community and you have a driveway that was lined with trees, you want to replace those trees, that can go through the reserve fund. If you had that driveway coming up and there were no trees there, you all of a sudden want to put trees there to improve the curb appeal, that cannot go through the reserve fund. That's brand new, was not there before.
But going forward, were those like new trees, could that be part of the reserve fund going forward?
Yes, because then as the next reserve fund study is done, there will be an allowance for that, so that should go through. But always there's gray area. We do our best to interpret what can go through the reserve fund, but for certain complexities, it's always best to refer to our lawyer friends.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for participating in this discussion. We realize basically as board directors that while it's very exciting to do upgrades in curb appeal to enhance our curb appeal, and it can be anywhere from a simple paint upgrade up to a complete change of the front of our building. There's many considerations that we have to take into account, whether it's financial or whether it's legal. And once we get those all clear, we can proceed with our projects. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Condo.